A billionaire mother came to the hospital to visit her son, who was in a coma. But at his bedside, she saw a waitress with a child. The boy turned out to be no stranger, and that changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The hospital had its own rhythm, one that seemed to stretch time into endless repetition. Lights glowed with a steady artificial calm. Polished floors reflected the footsteps of nurses who moved with soft efficiency, and the scent of antiseptic lingered in every corridor like an invisible fog. This was not a place for joy or hope. It was a liminal space between life and death, a waiting room for fate itself. For 3 months, Evelyn Harlow had walked those corridors every day at precisely the same hour, her routine as unwavering as the ticking of the clock on her penthouse wall. The staff, accustomed to her presence, would nod politely or lower their voices when she passed, aware of her status and the quiet gravity she carried. They all knew who she was, the billionaire at the helm of Harlow Industries, a name synonymous with power. But here, in the corridors of St. Augustine's private clinic, she was only another mother watching her child linger on the edge of existence. When Evelyn entered the room, it was always the same. Her son Damien lay still beneath the sterile white sheets, his body supported by machines that breathed and monitored for him. He looked almost peaceful, his dark hair brushed neatly back, his skin pale against the hospital pillow. But that peace was deceptive. It was not rest. It was a coma. Evelyn had memorized every detail of that sight, the rise and fall of his chest guided by machinery, the faint electronic beeps marking each heartbeat, the tubes and wires that turned her once vibrant air into a fragile shadow of himself. Doctors called his state stable, but Evelyn heard the unspoken words behind it, suspended, uncertain, perhaps permanent. She had built her life on certainty, on numbers that could be calculated, and outcomes that could be predicted. Her empire thrived because she never accepted maybe as an answer. But here, in this room, maybe had become her prison. Every visit left her with the same crushing helplessness, and yet she returned, because to stay away would feel like surrender. She brought fresh flowers each morning, sometimes white orchids, sometimes lilies, and placed them in the vase by his bed, as if beauty could coax him back into the world. That evening, however, something broke the repetition. As she approached the door, Evelyn adjusted her gloves and pushed it open, prepared for the same stillness she had faced for 90 days. But the sight that greeted her froze her in place. She was not alone. In the dim light of the room, a young woman sat by Damien's bedside. Her uniform was unmistakable, a simple worn dress with a name tag clipped crookedly to the front, the kind of outfit worn by waitresses in low-end diners. Her hair was tied back hastily, her shoes scuffed from long hours of work. Beside her, balanced on a chair far too large for him, was a small boy. He could not have been more than 4 years old, with tight curls framing his round face. His hands rested on his knees as he leaned toward the bed, his lips moving in whispers Evelyn could not quite hear. For a long moment, Evelyn could not breathe. The intrusion felt almost sacrilegious, as though these strangers had violated a sanctuary meant only for her and her son. Anger rose first, hot and instinctive. How dare they sit at Damien's side, as if they belonged here? But before she could speak, her eyes fell on the boy. He turned slightly, and in that brief glance, Evelyn felt her pulse falter. His eyes, serene, gray-green, luminous even in the shadow of the hospital room, were eyes she knew. Eyes she had seen in the mirror during her youth. Eyes Damien had carried into adulthood. The resemblance was undeniable, too precise to be coincidence. She stood rooted to the doorway, clutching the strap of her handbag until the leather pressed hard against her palm. The young woman did not look up immediately. She was focused entirely on Damien, her posture protective, her hand resting over his in a gesture of intimacy that Evelyn had not allowed herself. It was the kind of touch filled with familiarity, with love unspoken but deeply lived. And then the boy leaned forward, whispering something close to Damien's ear. The monitor beside the bed beeped in its steady rhythm, indifferent, but Evelyn felt as if the air itself had shifted. The realization struck her in waves, crashing one after another. This was not a chance intrusion. These were not random strangers. There was a connection here, one that Damien had hidden from her with deliberate care. She had spent years believing she knew every corner of her son's life, had managed his future with meticulous precision, and yet here was a woman she had never seen, and a boy who carried her family's eyes. The betrayal cut deeper than any corporate defeat she had endured. She finally stepped into the room, the sound of her heels sharp against the floor. The woman startled, glancing up quickly, and Evelyn saw her face streaked with the remnants of tears. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with a beauty softened by exhaustion and worry. Her uniform marked her as someone who lived on wages Evelyn would have spent in an afternoon. And yet, despite the weariness, there was dignity in her gaze, a quiet strength that did not bow to Evelyn's presence. Evelyn's instinct was to demand answers, to order the woman and child out of the room, but the words caught in her throat. She was not accustomed to hesitation. In her world, hesitation was weakness. Yet standing there, she felt something she had not felt in decades, uncertainty. The boy looked back at her with those impossibly familiar eyes, and for a moment she saw not a stranger's child, but a continuation of Damien himself, a living fragment of what she thought she had lost. She clenched her gloves tighter, her mind a whirlwind. Who was this woman? What right did she have to sit by Damien's bed with such intimacy? And the boy, was he truly what her instincts whispered he must be? Evelyn's heart pounded with questions, each more terrifying than the last. If this was Damien's child, then her son had lived a secret life, one that Evelyn had never been allowed to witness. And now, in the sterile quiet of this hospital room, the consequences of that secrecy had come to confront her. The machines continued their indifferent chorus. The scent of antiseptic thickened the air. Evelyn felt the ground shift beneath her carefully ordered world. For 3 months she had believed her life was defined by waiting for her son to wake, for doctors to deliver news, for time to decide his fate. But now she understood that waiting was over. Something had begun in this room, something she had not anticipated, and it threatened to unravel everything she thought she controlled. She straightened her posture, as if bracing herself for battle, though she did not yet know against whom. The young woman's hand still rested protectively over Damien's. The boy shifted in his chair, whispering once more, and Evelyn's eyes narrowed as the beeping monitor flickered slightly, almost imperceptibly. It was as though Damien himself, trapped in silence, had responded not to his mother's presence, but to theirs. In that moment, Evelyn felt both a surge of jealousy and an ache of something unfamiliar, something dangerously close to longing. She had come here to sit in silence beside her son, but she had walked into a revelation instead. And though she could not yet name it, she sensed that her life, her empire, her certainties, her power, was about to change in ways she could never have predicted. The room seemed smaller now, the air heavier, as Evelyn stood watching the woman and child who had disrupted her ritual of grief. She did not speak, not yet. Words would come later, when she had gathered her strength. For now, she observed, calculating, her mind already racing toward answers. But deep inside, beneath the layers of control and pride, there was a pulse of fear. Because Evelyn Harlow, who had always believed herself unshakable, had just seen the future staring back at her through the eyes of a child. And nothing would ever be the same again. When Evelyn left the hospital that evening, the steady rain of late autumn fell like a veil over the city, streaking the windows of her black sedan as it pulled away from the clinic. She sat in silence, her hands folded in her lap, the chauffeur wisely refraining from conversation. Her thoughts moved with a relentless intensity, circling around the image of the young woman in the worn waitress uniform and the boy with eyes that mirrored her son's. It was not an image she could dismiss. It had pierced her defenses in a way no corporate rival or personal setback ever had. She had built her life on mastery, on ensuring that no detail escaped her notice, yet here she had been blindsided in the most personal way imaginable. Damien had hidden something from her, and not something small or inconsequential. He had hidden a life, a family. The shame and anger burned inside her, but beneath them pulsed a deeper and more dangerous feeling. Fear that her son had never truly belonged to her. The following morning, before she even returned to the clinic, Evelyn set her plan into motion. She summoned her most trusted private investigator, a man named Harold Gray, whose discretion and efficiency had dismantled more than one opponent in the business world. Her instructions were sharp and simple. She wanted everything on the woman and the child: names, addresses, employment records, financial history, medical files, and above all, proof of connection to Damien. Nothing less than total clarity would suffice. If there were secrets, she would expose them, and if there were lies, she would destroy them. Evelyn did not tolerate uncertainty, not in her company and certainly not in her family. The first reports arrived within days, bound neatly in folders that Evelyn reviewed in her library late into the night. She spread the pages across her mahogany desk, her reading glasses perched low on her nose, her expression tightening as she read. The woman's name was Lila Williams, 26 years old, raised in a working-class neighborhood, no college education beyond a brief attempt at community courses she could not afford to finish. She worked long hours in a diner on 7th Street, a place Evelyn had never deigned to notice, and supplemented her income with cleaning jobs at a hotel downtown. She lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the poorer side of the city, the kind of building Evelyn's company had once considered demolishing to make way for condominiums. Lila's life was unremarkable, almost invisible, defined by survival rather than success. Yet in every line of testimony gathered by the investigator, one detail repeated. She was known as a devoted mother. Neighbors described her as exhausted but endlessly attentive, the kind of woman who would return home from a 12-hour shift and still kneel on the floor to play with her son. Teachers at the preschool spoke of a child who arrived on time every morning with clean clothes, a packed lunch, and a mother who always asked about his progress. There was no evidence of neglect, no shadow of irresponsibility. For all her poverty, Lila had built a world of care around her child, and the boy, Jaden, thrived within it. Evelyn read the statements with a growing discomfort. The narrative she had wanted to prove Lila unfit, to prove the boy better off in her own custody, was slipping away before it could even be constructed. But it was the photographs that undid her composure. Harold had unearthed pictures from years past, images captured by friends, by cheap disposable cameras, even by the woman's own phone. There was Damien, standing in a small kitchen with a chipped counter, holding a spatula in one hand and laughing as he flipped pancakes. There he was again, seated on the floor of a modest living room, Jaden, a toddler, crawling clumsily toward him, while Lila looked on with a smile. In another, Damien held both mother and child close, his face radiant with a joy Evelyn had never seen directed at her. The evidence was undeniable. These were not casual acquaintances, not temporary entanglements. This was a family built quietly in the shadows of a world Damien had kept hidden from his mother's gaze. Evelyn closed the folder with shaking hands, her mind racing through memories of her son. She had always known him as disciplined, charming, ambitious in his own way, though never as ruthless as she had hoped he would be. He had tolerated her control, even resisted it at times, but she had assumed his resistance was the arrogance of youth. Now she saw it differently. He had not merely resisted her authority, he had deliberately carved out a separate life, one she could not reach, one she could not shape. The discovery stung with the bitterness of betrayal. Yet anger was not the only emotion that gripped her. Beneath it lay an unexpected grief, a mourning not just for the 3 months of his silence in the hospital bed, but for the years in which he had smiled in someone else's kitchen, celebrated birthdays with another family, whispered bedtime stories to a child Evelyn had never been allowed to know. It was as if she had lost him long before the accident, and only now was she beginning to understand how completely. The next day at the clinic, she observed Lila from the corner of the room. The young woman had returned, as if she belonged there, sitting by Damien's bed with Jaden on her lap. The boy's small fingers wrapped around his father's motionless hand, his lips moving as he recited from a colorful picture book. Evelyn stood silently by the window, her arms folded across her chest, her sharp eyes fixed on the monitors. And then she saw it, the faintest flicker of change, the needle of the heart monitor shifting, the subtle movement of Damien's eyelids fluttering. It was almost imperceptible, but it was real. She had watched her son for 3 months without a single change, and now, in the presence of that child, something stirred. The doctors confirmed later that there were minor fluctuations, nothing they could call progress with certainty, but enough to note. Evelyn could not ignore the implication. Her son, suspended in a coma beyond her reach, seemed to respond to the presence of the boy. The realization filled her with a strange blend of awe and fury. She was his mother, yet her presence had never elicited so much as a flicker. And here was a child who might very well be his son, awakening something within him that even the finest medicine could not touch. Back in her library that evening, Evelyn pored once more over the documents, this time with a grim determination. The evidence of connection between Damien and Lila was overwhelming, but it was not enough for her to simply accept it. She wanted control, and control required certainty. She demanded birth certificates, hospital records, anything that could legally prove Jaden's parentage. Harold reported that the paperwork was surprisingly difficult to track. Records were incomplete, and some documents were missing altogether. It was as if the boy had slipped through the cracks of the system, an oversight Evelyn found both suspicious and infuriating. Still, she could not deny what her eyes had seen. Jaden's resemblance to Damien was uncanny, the photographs unassailable. More than that, the boy's presence seemed to stir life where there had been only silence. Evelyn's empire had been built on the ability to read the smallest signs, to interpret fluctuations in markets and shifts in loyalty before others even noticed. And here, in the monitors of a hospital room, she had seen a signal she could not ignore. Damien's future, and perhaps the future of the Harlow legacy itself, was entangled with this child. She sat back in her chair, staring at the darkened window where her reflection merged with the city lights beyond. For the first time, she felt the weight of inevitability. She could not erase what had been revealed. Lila Williams and her son were no longer shadows at the edge of her world. They were central figures in a story that would define the rest of her life. Whether she liked it or not, the boy was a Harlow, and Evelyn knew with cold clarity that she would not allow the Harlow legacy to be shaped by anyone but herself. But as she turned back to the folder, her fingers tracing the images of Damien's hidden joy, Evelyn felt a hesitation she could not quite name. The photographs showed a version of her son she had never seen, unguarded, content, almost free. It struck her that perhaps Lila had given him something Evelyn herself had never managed to provide. And though she tried to push the thought aside, it lingered like a thorn in her chest, an uncomfortable reminder that power could not buy everything, not even the love of a son. The sound of the rain against the windows deepened as midnight approached, the city wrapped in storm. Evelyn gathered the papers into neat stacks, aligning their edges with ruthless precision. She had answers now, but they only bred more questions, questions that clawed at her composure. Who exactly was this young woman? How had she managed to hold Damien's heart so completely in secret? And most of all, what role would she play now that fate had forced them into collision? Evelyn blew out the candle on her desk, leaving the room in darkness. Tomorrow she would return to the clinic, and tomorrow she would confront what she had uncovered. For the first time in years, she did not know how the game would end. The storm that had gathered inside Evelyn's mind after those long nights in her library did not abate. Each folder she had examined, each report she had read, had given her clarity, but clarity had only sharpened her resolve. The boy was Damien's, of that she no longer harbored doubt. His presence at the hospital, his uncanny resemblance, the photographs of her son's laughter in places Evelyn had never entered, all of it converged into one undeniable truth. But for Evelyn Harlow, truth was only the beginning of a negotiation. What mattered was power, and she could not, would not allow power over Damien's child to rest in the hands of a woman who wore the uniform of poverty and scraped together a life in the margins. Jaden belonged to the Harlow name, and by extension, to her. When she returned to the clinic the next morning, her eyes carried a steely brightness, the kind of gaze that had once unsettled boardrooms and silenced dissenting voices. She entered Damien's room and saw Lila seated as she always was, her hand resting lightly over Damien's. The boy nestled against her side. There was something unshakable about the image, as though this fragile tableau of mother and child had been carved into permanence. Evelyn stood for a long moment by the window, her silence deliberate, her posture regal. Then she moved to the foot of the bed, her presence filling the room like a chill draft. She said nothing of what she had discovered, Nothing of the evidence she had pored over in the nights before. Instead, she watched them both as a predator might watch prey, calculating the timing of her strike. Later that day, Evelyn summoned her legal team. In the glass-walled conference room high above the city, her attorney sat in tense silence as she outlined her intentions. She wanted custody, or at the very least legal guardianship, of the boy. She spoke with the same cold logic she used to describe corporate acquisitions. Lila Williams was unfit, not because of neglect, but because of circumstance. Poverty, lack of education, the precariousness of her employment, all of it could be molded into an argument. The courts, Evelyn reminded her lawyers, responded not only to law but to influence, and she had influence in abundance. She had contributed to campaigns, financed judgeships, extended favors that could now be called upon. A woman like Lila could never withstand the weight of Harlow resources in a courtroom. Yet beneath the polished arguments lay something more primal. Evelyn was not merely securing a future for Jaden. She was reclaiming the future she believed Damien had stolen from her by hiding this life. She would not let her bloodline vanish into obscurity, raised in cramped apartments and anonymous diners. The boy would be a Harlow, molded in the image of the dynasty she had spent her life constructing. When she approached Lila with her proposal, she did so with the confidence of a woman who had never once been denied. She offered money first, large sums that would have lifted Lila out of her poverty forever. She spoke of apartments in better neighborhoods, schools with sterling reputations, opportunities that would ensure Jaden never knew the hunger or uncertainty that had shaped his early years. To Evelyn, these offers were irresistible. They were the currency of the world, but she had underestimated the resolve of the woman before her. Lila listened, her face calm, her eyes unwavering, and then she refused. She refused not with anger or accusation, but with a quiet certainty that shook Evelyn more than rage could have. It was incomprehensible. Evelyn had spent a lifetime bending others to her will, their principles dissolving under the pressure of wealth and status. Yet here stood a young woman with nothing, who still said no. Lila's refusal was not born of ignorance, but of conviction. She understood what Evelyn was offering, and she rejected it not because she failed to grasp its magnitude, but because she valued something greater. She valued presence over privilege, love over legacy. To her, Jaden was not a Harlow heir to be groomed for greatness. He was her son, her daily joy and responsibility, the child she had raised alone through exhaustion and sacrifice. No amount of money could erase the years of nights spent soothing nightmares, the mornings of hurried breakfasts, the afternoons of small triumphs and scraped knees. Evelyn's indignation grew with each refusal. She shifted tactics, moving from persuasion to threat. If money would not sway Lila, then the law would. She instructed her attorneys to prepare petitions questioning Lila's fitness as a parent, citing long work hours, unstable income, and the inability to provide the life a Harlow deserved. She leveraged her connections, whispering to allies in positions of power, weaving a net she believed would tighten inexorably around the young woman. In her mind, this was not cruelty but necessity. She told herself she was saving the boy from mediocrity, from the obscurity that had claimed too many lives on the margins. She would elevate him, even if it meant tearing him from the arms of the only mother he had ever known. But Lila did not retreat. Instead, she began to gather her own quiet defenses. Neighbors who had seen her devotion spoke willingly of her care. Teachers at Jaden's preschool described his happiness, his health, his eager smile each morning. Even some of the hospital staff, moved by the sight of the boy reading to his father, expressed their support. What Evelyn had failed to understand was that love created its own form of power, one not measured in money but in loyalty. Lila had built a life rich in witnesses to her devotion, and those witnesses would not remain silent. The tension between the two women thickened with each passing day. Evelyn entered the hospital room with the commanding air of an owner inspecting her property, while Lila remained by Damien's side with the quiet assurance of one who knew her place was earned, not taken. Jaden, oblivious to the undercurrents, continued to chatter softly to his father, his small hand always wrapped around Damien's larger one. Each time Evelyn saw her son's fingers twitch in faint response, Each time the monitors shifted with some subtle sign of recognition, her fury deepened. For 3 months she had sat in silence with no change. But this boy she had not known existed, could stir life where she could not. In the quiet of her penthouse, Evelyn stared out at the skyline, the city sprawling beneath her like a kingdom she had conquered. She thought of the years she had spent molding Damien, shaping his education, guiding his career, all with the intention of ensuring he carried forward the Harlow name. And now she saw him lying in a hospital bed, his fate tethered to a woman and child she had not chosen, a family born outside her plans. It was intolerable. If she could not control Damien any longer, she would control his son. That much she swore. But beneath the steel of her determination, there was a flicker she could not extinguish, a faint echo of something she had glimpsed in those photographs of pancakes and birthday candles. Damien had looked happy, truly happy, in a way he never had under her guidance. The thought haunted her, gnawed at her, even as she pressed forward with her campaign. It was the first time in decades that Evelyn Harlow doubted whether power alone could win her what she desired. The battle lines were drawn, though no court date had yet been set. Each woman prepared in her own way, Evelyn with her attorneys and influence, Lila with her resilience and community. In the sterile air of the hospital where Damien lay, suspended between silence and awakening, the struggle for the boy's future began to take shape. It was not merely a conflict over custody or inheritance. It was a conflict of visions, one rooted in wealth and control, the other in love and endurance. And though neither woman would admit it aloud, both understood that Damien himself, still locked within the fragile prison of his body, remained the unspoken judge whose awakening could change everything. Evelyn left the clinic one evening with her jaw set, her plans sharpened like weapons. Lila remained behind, settling Jaden in the chair by his father's bed, her fingers brushing Damien's as though she could tether him to the world through touch alone. The machines hummed, the monitors glowed, and in the shadows of that room, the future of a family hung suspended, awaiting a verdict neither wealth nor love could yet deliver. The weeks of silent tension between Evelyn and Lila gathered like storm clouds over the hospital room, their presence almost as palpable as the constant beeping of the machines that surrounded Damien's bed. Each day felt heavier, the conflict pressing closer to an inevitable breaking point. Evelyn's lawyers had prepared documents, drafted arguments, and lined up allies ready to sway the courts in her favor. She had whispered her intentions in the ears of officials who owed her favors, each step designed to secure Jaden's future under the Harlow name. Yet even with her formidable arsenal of influence, Evelyn sensed resistance. It was not only Lila's quiet determination that unsettled her, it was the undeniable truth that the boy was thriving in his mother's care. That contradiction gnawed at her, undermining the certainty she usually wielded like a sword. In the evenings, Evelyn stood at the window of her penthouse looking out over the city she had mastered. The skyline gleamed, a monument to her ambition, but its brilliance felt hollow now. She thought of her son lying motionless beneath the sterile glow of hospital lights, thought of the photographs she had discovered of him smiling in a modest kitchen, and felt the sting of something dangerously close to regret. She had built her empire on the belief that power could shape everything, markets, people, destinies, but here was evidence that power could not shape happiness. The smile she had seen in those photographs was one she had never inspired, and it haunted her like a ghost. At the clinic, the battle for Jaden's future continued silently with every encounter. Evelyn arrived dressed in tailored perfection, her perfume and jewelry filling the small room with the aura of wealth, while Lila came in her modest clothes, her hair tied back, her hands often rough from long shifts. Between them lay Damien, the axis of their conflict, his body unmoving, his fate undecided. The boy never seemed to notice the tension. Jaden climbed onto the chair beside the bed each day, his small voice filling the room with stories and songs. His words were simple, yet they carried a weight neither woman could deny. They reached a place beyond medicine, beyond law, beyond power. And it was during one of those afternoons when Jaden pressed his small hand into Damien's that everything began to change. It started subtly. The monitors flickered with new rhythms, the steady beeps shifting in pattern. Lila noticed first, leaning closer, her breath catching as she thought she had imagined it. Then Evelyn saw it too, the faint movement of Damien's fingers, the flutter of his eyelids beneath lashes that had remained still for months. For a moment both women froze, disbelief holding them in place. Then the monitors confirmed what their eyes had seen, a shift, small but undeniable. Damien was responding. Doctors hurried into the room, their voices brisk but tinged with astonishment. They spoke of neurological responses, of thresholds crossed, of the possibility that he was beginning to emerge. Evelyn's heart pounded as she stepped forward, her eyes wide with hope. But when Damien's fingers closed ever so slightly, it was around Jaden's hand, not hers. The boy laughed with innocent delight, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, while Evelyn felt the air leave her lungs. She had waited 3 months for a sign of life, and when it came, it was not in answer to her vigil, but to the presence of the child she had tried to claim. The days that followed were filled with cautious optimism from the medical staff. Damien's responses grew more consistent, small signs that his mind was stirring from the long silence. He squeezed Lila's hand, his eyes flickered open for brief moments, his head turned faintly toward the sound of Jaden's voice. Each gesture was fragile, but they were undeniable proofs that he was reaching for the world again. For Evelyn, they were also reminders of her exclusion. She had sat faithfully by his side, yet it was Lila and Jaden who drew him back. The realization shook her to the core. She had built her life on control, on bending others to her will, but here she was powerless. No amount of money could command her son to respond to her. No legal maneuver could force his fingers to tighten around her hand. She stood at the edge of the bed, watching as her grandson whispered into his father's ear, and her son, against all odds, stirred in answer. For the first time in her life, Evelyn Harlow felt like an outsider in her own family. That night she left the hospital later than usual, her driver waiting in silence as she stared out the car window. The city glowed with its endless lights, but she felt no kinship with its pulse. In her mind she replayed the moment Damien had moved, his faint gesture of life directed toward the boy. She could not dismiss it, could not interpret it as coincidence. It was a message, one she did not want to hear but could not deny. Her son's heart belonged not to the empire she had envisioned for him, but to the small circle of love he had built beyond her reach. The legal machinery Evelyn had set in motion pressed on, but for the first time she hesitated. She thought of standing before a judge, arguing that Lila was unfit, when the truth was evident to anyone who saw her with Jaden. She thought of her grandson growing up in the cold halls of her mansion, surrounded by wealth but deprived of the warmth he had always known. And she thought of Damien, slowly waking, his body frail, his mind uncertain, and what he might say if he found the family he had created torn apart by his mother's ambition. The image unsettled her in ways she could not articulate. Meanwhile, Lila continued as she always had, steady and unyielding. She bathed Jaden, read to him, fed him simple meals brought from home, and every evening she sat by Damien's bed until the nurses gently asked her to leave. She did not waver, even as whispers reached her that Evelyn's lawyers were preparing to act. To those who asked, she simply said she would protect her son, no matter what came. Her conviction was quiet but absolute, and those around her recognized it. More and more, the hospital staff found themselves admiring her resilience. One afternoon, as Evelyn entered the room, she stopped short at the sight before her. Lila sat with Jaden on her lap, the boy holding a picture book and pointing at the illustrations, his small voice filling the air with delight. Damien's eyes were half open, glazed but focused, following the movement of the boy's hand across the page. It was the most present he had seemed in months. Lila leaned close, her voice soft, and Damien's lips moved faintly, the whisper of a sound escaping. The nurses gasped, confirming that he had tried to speak. Evelyn felt something in her chest tighten painfully. She had spent months commanding silence with her power, and here, with nothing but the tenderness of a child and the devotion of a woman she had dismissed, her son was beginning to return. In that moment, Evelyn knew the truth she had fought to suppress. The battle she had waged was not truly about the boy. It was about herself, about her refusal to accept that love could exist beyond her control. She had tried to buy Jaden, to threaten Lila, to bend the world to her will. But her son's faint whisper, his first attempt at reaching for life, had been drawn not by her wealth or her presence, but by the family he had chosen. The days lengthened into weeks, and Damien's progress continued. Slowly, haltingly, he re-entered the world. His voice was weak, his movements limited, but he began to recognize faces, to respond with flickers of emotion. Evelyn remained by his side, but she no longer sought to command the space. She stood back, watching Lila hold his hand, watching Jaden lay his head on his father's chest, listening to the quiet joy in the voices of those two who had anchored him through the silence. She realized with a clarity that cut through her pride that if she wished to remain part of this story, she would have to learn to share it. One evening after the doctors had left and the room was quiet save for the hum of machines, Evelyn stood by the window while Lila settled Jaden into sleep in a chair beside the bed. Damien's eyes followed the scene, heavy but aware, and for the first time since the accident, Evelyn saw something familiar in them. It was not the gratitude she had expected, not the deference she had once demanded. It was a quiet reproach, a reminder of the distance her choices had created. And yet beneath it, there was the possibility of reconciliation. If she could humble herself, if she could allow love to take precedence over legacy, there might still be a place for her in the life her son was reclaiming. The room was filled with silence, but it was no longer the silence of despair. It was the silence of beginnings, fragile and uncertain, but alive. Evelyn turned from the window and looked at her grandson, asleep with his small hand still resting on his father's arm. She felt the sharp edges of her pride soften, replaced by something she had not felt in decades: hope. Not the hope of empire or inheritance, but the hope that perhaps, even now, she could choose differently. Perhaps family was not something to be owned, but something to be shared. For the first time in her life, Evelyn Harlow stepped back willingly, allowing another to hold the center. Damien was stirring back into life, guided not by her commands, but by the love of those he had chosen. And as she stood in the dim hospital light, Evelyn realized that her greatest battle was not against Lila or the courts, but against herself. If she could surrender her need for control, she might finally find the family she had been searching for all along. If this story kept you watching until the end, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.